and welcome to Under the Umbrella. I'm WDTN Plus meteorologist Melissa Barrington. And on the show, we like to highlight various aspects of weather and how they may impact the community. And we try to pick a new topic each week. So this week, I actually had the opportunity to see a presentation by Sean Dahl, who is the service coordinator for the Space Weather Prediction Center. And I saw a presentation back in the spring, and I thought maybe everyone else might really be interested in this topic because it is far and wide ranging, and a lot of folks don't even know that it exists. And basically, the topic is space weather. And like I said, this is Sean Dahl, and he is the service coordinator for the Space Weather Prediction Center. And thanks a lot for joining us today, Sean. How are you?
Very good, Melissa. Thanks for having us. Good to be here.
Well, first of all, let's just go to the very basic question of what is space weather?
The easiest answer is what's taking place on that sun 93 million miles away here from Earth in that huge vacuum of space between the sun and the Earth and ultimately at here and around our planet. And we care about space weather because of the effects and impacts that this can have on our way of life.
So, what causes space weather?
A whole litany of things because the sun is not just this giant ball of tame light that we see every day as a sunrise on to sunset. It's this giant ball of burning gas. And what that does is not only does it emit heat and light, but there's chaos involved. And all that chaos has to do with not only the sun's structure, but its magnetic fields. And these things come together to create disturbances, stresses, and those release. And that's how we get a wide variety of different types of space weather storms that we are forecasting here at the Space Weather Prediction Center.
So, do sunspots play a role in what you're forecasting and also the solar cycle?
Yes, they do, Melissa, most certainly. So the solar cycle is an 11-year average period of time in which the sun goes from a minimum of activity up to a maximum and back down to a minimum. 11 years over that course of time. Right now, we are in and around solar maximum, perhaps beginning to come back down from solar maximum. But because of the changes the sun has, and those changes result from the sun's rotation. So the equator, the center of the sun, is rotating about 10 days faster than the poles of the sun. That's extraordinary. But what that does do with the sun is it messes with its magnetic field. It kind of laps itself over time. And this is what causes the sun's magnetic poles to flip every 11 years, which relates, of course, to the solar cycle. And when that happens, there's all these twisted magnetic fields deeper inside the sun, and sometimes they'll puncture through the surface throughout the course of the cycle, especially around maximum. And those strong magnetic fields, they can be revealed as sunspot groups. So sunspots do relate to a lot of space weather storms. They're not the only reason we have them, but they're the number one feature that we focus on the sun as forecasters as we try to forecast these various types of space weather storms.
So, I've also heard that there's something called a CME. Can you explain what that is and how it impacts the Earth?
Yeah, of course, it's a coronal mass ejection,
Hmm.
or CME, as you said for short. Now, CME is not a solar flare.
Okay.
Solar flares can be associated with CME. So let's just talk about the three things really quickly to lead up to the CME. So
Okay.
a solar flare is a very energetic release of X-ray energy because that's how we measure it. It's different wavelengths of energy as well, but X-rays are what we measure because X-rays have an immediate effect on our outer atmosphere because it protects us from X-rays. That's why they don't harm us on the surface. But it messes with the structure and that can cause various types of communication to not work properly. The energetic particles that can be associated with these solar flare events or magnetic field changes are like a giant release of energetic particles into space in the form of protons. So think of kind of like a hailstorm, except these aren't that big, they're tiny, but they penetrate things from satellite components or even human tissue for astronauts in space. This is why it's a radiation concern for them. And then, of course, coronal mass ejections that you asked about. This is a giant release of solar material in the form of charged particles and solar material called plasma and strong magnetic fields which stretch out into space. So you can see a solar flare. The effect is immediate. It's already made its 8-minute journey here to Earth. So the effect is already on the daylight side of our planet. then we can look forward to see maybe as fast as 15 to 20 minutes the arrival of these energetic particles, these protons. And then even slower yet is the coronal mass ejections that could ultimately arrive here and interact with Earth's magnetic barrier, our magnetosphere, and that's what causes these things called geomagnetic storms.
So, are they harmful at all to us here on Earth? I know you mentioned how it can affect an astronaut, but what about, does the atmosphere protect us here from those radiations from the solar flares and from the CMEs?
Yes, Melissa, do. We have a two-layer protection system between that atmospheric filter that we have and then our magnetic shield. So these both work together to help protect us from these energetic particles. Therefore, they don't reach the surface. You could be on Mount Everest having the time of your life if you're into that, and you're not going to be harmed by these events. But if you're a satellite or an astronaut above that protective barriers, you can be influenced by these. And we're going back to the moon. So, a major concern for the astronauts on Artemis 2 and eventually Artemis 3 is that they will be outside of both protective barriers and therefore they will be very exposed. So, we're going to be their direct line of support for their safety. We'll even have a forecaster or two deployed to Houston Mission Control for their support. The geomagnetic storms, on the other hand, they don't affect human health, but they do drive changes that can make these radiation storms a bit stronger. So, they are concerning. But the major thing about geomagnetic storms is the effect they have on such a wide ranging of technologies, from the electric power grid to satellite orbits in space to GPS accuracy and more.
So, are these storms predictable? And if they are, what are you looking for when predicting these storms? And is it kind of like the same thing like when we're just forecasting the weather? Is it looking like, like we say a storm's coming the next day, or, a storm's going to come in later on tonight? Do you know like that timing as well?
Yeah, we generally do, but
Uh huh.
space weather forecasting is extremely hard. And it sounds like I'm using that as an excuse, but think about it, that the sun's 93 million miles away, and we're trying to forecast whether or not an event is going to hit Earth in the form of, say, a CME or a radiation storm. And we're this tiny little blue marble. 109 planet Earths fit across the center of the sun if you put them in a straight line across just the equator facing side. So we're this tiny thing in space. So trying to predict the arrival of those is very difficult. You alluded to meteorology and weather forecasting. So, you're just trying to forecast the path of a severe storm or a known tornado, 20 miles further down the road is very difficult and what that might mean. So imagine 93 million miles. Now, we do forecast these events. We do our best. We forecast out 3 days in advance. So we put out a 3-day forecast for all three of those types of storms we've talked about, the solar flares, solar radiation storms, or the proton events, and the geomagnetic storms. And that's what we have compiled in our 3-day forecast that's available twice a day, once in the evening and once again in the early morning hours.
And where can you find these forecasts?
You can find them directly on our Space Weather Prediction Center, SWPC. So I'm going to say SWIPC from here on when I say Space Weather Prediction Center, on our webpage, and that's at spaceweather.gov.
Okay, that's pretty simple, spaceweather.gov. So, do you also then use computer models? I assume, like how we use weather computer models down here on Earth.
Yes, we do, Melissa. The only disadvantage we have is that we don't have enough of them.
Oh,
In terrestrial meteorology, we have hundreds of different models, all sorts of things that can be looked at. Some have, strengths in forecasting some certain type of phenomena, and others maybe not so much. So you can kind of select your model of choice as a
mhm.
meteorologist. And by the way, most of us have a meteorology background, including myself, so we know of what we speak. In space weather, we don't have many models. Most of them are still in the research side and really haven't become operational. We have a few operational models. One of them is what we call the geospace model. It helps predict solar wind changes based off what's happening in space 1 million miles from Earth, where that satellite resides. That's our early warning buoy, if you will. And another one called the WSA-ENLO model that help us forecast the arrival of these coronal mass ejections and how Earth effectual they might be, meaning how direct of an impact could they be here at Earth. But we have a long ways to go when it comes to model development and making them better, because there's still so many subjective parts of the input to some of these models, especially on the CME analysis for that WSA NLO model.
Now you mentioned that you're a meteorologist. So, how do you switch over from regular meteorology to becoming a space meteorologist?
it can be
I'm
be
curious.
very difficult. You know, it's a different way of thinking, right? In terrestrial meteorology, at least when I first came into this a long, long time ago,
Okay.
it was still very difficult. And you were very happy if you got like a fog forecast correct. Well, today that's become a lot better. You know, we do a good job of forecasting those events, but maybe just not certain the intensity or depth of something, or the timing could be a little off.
Uh-huh.
But in space weather, we're just happy if we're forecasting a CME to arrive here like we are today, as a matter of
Oh,
fact, a smaller, fainter CME. And if it actually does arrive here at Earth, because there's so many variables. Remember, I said a CME has solar charged particles in it, and then it has these strong magnetic fields. Well, those magnetic fields, we never know what they look like until they've made 92 million miles of transit from the sun, and they finally hit the satellite only a million miles from Earth, our precious space weather observatory out there that measures the solar wind. That's when we finally find out just how strong that magnetic field is and whether or not it's the same as Earth's or opposite, because that makes all the difference in the world of just how strong of a geomagnetic storm we might get here around our planet.
wow. So that takes quite a while to find out if you verify or not your forecast.
It does. When we put out a watch like we did
Uh-huh.
2 days ago
Uh-huh.
for a G2 watch, now we have to wait. And now we're still waiting to see if that's actually going to arrive at the satellite a million miles away, because we're expecting it today, albeit we were expecting it to be rather weak. But yeah, that's what we do. We put out something, we get really busy, and then we got to wait and
Yeah.
wait
It's
and
kind of like
wait for it
waiting
to
for the
arrive.
high temperature for the day, except you're waiting even longer.
Exactly.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and take a quick break. And when we come back, we will talk more with Sean Dahl, who is from the Space Weather Prediction Center. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Under the Umbrella. Today we are joined by Sean Dahl, who is from the Space Weather Prediction Center, and he's telling us all about things that go on in outer space and the sun, and it's really very interesting. Some folks are probably also interested in what the aurora is as well and how it's connected to space weather. Can you tell us more?
Sure, Melissa. Yeah, the aurora, the northern lights here in this hemisphere that we live in for your show here. Yeah, it's a bucket list item for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been some very extraordinary auroral events over the course of the last several years because of solar maximum and just how active this cycle has actually been for aurora development. So the aurora is actually an interaction of those solar charged particles as part of, say, something like a coronal mass ejection, and they drive in through the polar regions into those magnetic fields, because those magnetic fields of Earth come out the bottom of our planet and go into the north geographic pole of our planet. So those are the entry points for these particles to come in. And they come in those regions, and the stronger, say, something like a CME is, the further equatorward those can be driven as well. And the interaction of those solar charged particles with Earth's naturally existing molecules at those highest levels in our atmosphere, that energy exchange eventually releases light. And that light is what we see as the northern lights, or what we call the aurora. So the aurora itself is a spectacular phenomena for people to see. I hope most people on your show have had the chance to see it. If not, they'll still have a chance over the course of the rest of this cycle. But yeah, there's interactions that are going above and beyond that that affect a lot of the technologies that we rely upon. And that's really what our focus here is at the Space Weather Prediction Center, is the effects to our technology.
So, what are some of the effects? And also, with the aurora, there, do they come in cycles, or is that something that you can see year round? How do you find out like when the aurora is going to be the brightest, like in your location?
Yeah, the aurora itself is it can happen at any time during a solar cycle, because there's other phenomena besides the big ones we've talked about. I'll just throw a name out there, but I won't necessarily describe it so much. Something called the coronal hole high speed stream.
Okay.
That's something we're actually dealing with right now as you and I are talking. Our solar wind speed has gone up,
Mm.
high speed stream. And that interacts with our magnetic field. More charged particles come in and they can drive the aurora up. I think right now we have a warning out for a G1, a minor storm scale level. So these can happen at any time. So paying attention to our forecast and the changes that happen with space weather gives people an idea of when to start paying attention for the chance to see the aurora or not. Now, the effects to our technology are vast with these events. They can be anything from communications with satellites in space to electric power grid operators, because these geomagnetic storms in particular, they cause currents to build up on our high voltage transmission lines. And that causes transformers that we all have to have for electricity to flow across this country to overheat. And the worst case scenario is that they'll damage the transformer to the point that they don't work. And that would cause a massive power outage on the scale beyond a city, beyond a county, beyond even a state, but states wide. And that's our number one concern when it comes to space weather. GPSs are affected. I have a great story about that and how that impactful that was just a year ago, and others that we just don't have the time to talk about because there's a lot of them, including even aviation.
Well, you did mention to me like there was a storm. Was it your brother in North Dakota where they were actually impacted by a geomagnetic storm? And who knew that there were actually warnings? And you said that there's tiered levels of warnings as well that folks should maybe pay attention to.
Yeah, exactly, Melissa. So to the story itself first.
Yes.
So yeah, in May of last year, we had the first extreme space weather storm, geomagnetic storm that we've had in over 20 years. That's the top of our scale, a G5. Now, mind you, one thing I want people to know is a G5 is just the top of the scale. You can have a G5 that's here, or you can have a G5 that's several stories above my head. The one we had in May was one of those that was here, an extraordinary storm, extreme, and it was very effectual. There are a lot of things that happened. One of those was me getting a phone call in the heat of that storm from my brother-in-law, who's a farmer in North Dakota. And he's like, "What is going on? My tractor, I'm trying to plant seeds out here. There's a rare break in the weather. It's not raining. And my GPS is supposed to be within an inch and it's off by 12 feet. I had to shut it off because it was not working at all." I had no idea until that point just how reliant farmers have become upon precision GPS to make sure they're getting the perfect rows, that they're not losing seeds into a ditch, that they're going in the right spot. And I had to explain to them, yeah, that's space weather. So that was the very first time in my life. As a meteorologist work, I'm always used to getting space weather or normal storm reports or jokes at me, but that's the first time in my life I ever received a space weather storm report from a family member. And it turns out he wasn't the only one. Farmers across the country had massive impacts in the same level. A professor out of Kansas State is wrapping up a study right now, and he's up to over $500,000 for just the corn planting alone because of the effects that that had on GPS systems.
So now we may have
So
to actually
yeah,
have storm space weather storm spotters for us so that you can find out where the outages are.
exactly. It doesn't hurt to do that. And when we put this information out, the more people share, the more they'll know because they also want to see the aurora, right? So
Right.
we're worried about the effects from those storms. We're making phone calls directly to the power grid of this country, the southern provinces of Canada and all 48 mainland United States. The representatives of the power grid get on that phone call at just a G3 level, the middle of that scale.
Hmm.
We're informing the White House and the National Security Council when we get to the high end. We're talking to FEMA at the 4 levels. Why? Because the nation cares and they know that space weather can cause some kind of collapse, maybe with satellites in space colliding or GPS not working and causing an incident or during a catastrophic response, not being able to get it to work properly and trying to save people's lives and find them, all the way to the power grid. That's why we care about space weather as a country, and that's why we do here at the Space Weather Prediction Center. On the good note, getting back to the first part of your question here, yeah, people can pay attention and they can relate that and sit back and relax because we're more likely not to have a big incident like that happen because we're making the right contacts and they're taking the right steps to protect things and keep them working. So people can sit back and hope to see the aurora. So for your area of the country, when we start talking about a G2 storm, especially a G3 storm, hey, it's time to pay attention that maybe the northern lights could be visible.
So can you just tell me like what is like, we talk about hurricane levels, category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's a threshold for each one. What is a threshold for like your base G1 storm versus the G5 storm? Is
Yeah,
that,
so that gets into another
oh,
index that we
okay.
have.
Well, I was just looking for maybe a simple answer.
Yeah, it can be simple. When we forecast these events in our 3-day forecast, there's another index that we're using. It's called the KP index. So think of it like this. You just mentioned it, the hurricane scale.
Hmm.
Now, you get to hurricane scale level, we know we have a hurricane on our hands, and then you
Correct.
categorize just how strong, how strong it is. Well, you have tropical storms as
Hmm.
well. Not a hurricane, but they're deadly.
Right.
They can be life threatening as well and damaging, right? Same thing with space weather. We have index levels that are important that we do make a few warnings for, but not until we get to this certain level. Now it warrants NOAA space weather attribution, and we call it, say, like a G1 storm or an R1 or an S1 type storm using the other scales. And then it logarithmically goes up from there.
Okay. So, can you explain why space weather is going to continue to be important for future space missions for folks, who are looking here? As you mentioned, Artemis is going to be going off, and how is that going to impact our future?
Yeah, because we're not just stopping at the moon, we plan on going to Mars.
Yeah.
And we continue to launch satellites in space. So astronauts, space tourism is becoming a thing, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we already know of celebrities that have gone up on short little jaunts up into the atmosphere and right back down, but eventually they're going to hang out in space. So space weather, as far as its effects on human health, is a big issue, not only for these astronauts right now, but even in the future for those that might be able to actually do something like that, like a space tourism thing. We have satellites. The storm in May of last year resulted in the largest satellite migration in known history. Over 5,000 satellites were burning fuel at the same time to combat that extreme geomagnetic storm, because that creates changes in the lower levels of our atmosphere that makes it more dense. So think of your hand pushing through water, and then think of your hand going through thick jello. There's a difference there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The atmosphere changes and the satellites struggle. They start to lose the war with gravity and they'll burn up in the atmosphere. So over 5,000 satellites were burning fuel, trying to get back to their proper orbit level because of the damage that was doing on their orbit from that storm. And these satellites don't know where they are. Operators don't know where everybody else's satellites are. So space collision avoidance is becoming a major concern. And that was the largest satellite migration in history until the storm a few months later in October. Not as extreme, but even more satellites are there now. And this is the way things are going to go. So the effects this has, even on space, affect us whether we realize it or not.
So you also mentioned future missions and stuff. Are you also monitoring, for example, the weather on Mars? If they're
Yeah,
going to go to Mars?
Thanks for that question, Melissa. No, NASA right now is responsible for anything dealing with Mars, like that might affect the Mars rover that's over there.
Uh-huh.
But we are going to be responsible for the astronauts when they go back to the moon. And eventually, as we work our way towards a mission to Mars, we here at SWPC are going to be responsible for those astronauts' safety and concerns when it comes to these storms. So right now, we don't track coronal mass ejections or radiation storms that are going anywhere other than towards Earth. NASA does, though, because of all the other probes out there. But as humans venture into space, yes, we will be part of that.
That's all really interesting. Well, I would like to thank Sean very much for joining me today on Under the Umbrella. Hopefully you learned something new if you didn't already know. And if you have an idea for another subject on Under the Umbrella, please give me a quick email. You can email me at undertheumbrella@wdtn.com. Have a great day.